Hilke, thank you so much. I'm very excited to talk with you. I have started reading your book and
Oh,
we
thank you.
definitely will discuss it. But I also want to just kind of take you back to the first moment where you specifically had an interaction with AI, what the context was around that, and kind of how you left after that experience. Let's take it back to before even the AI in the workplace topic and like where you specifically as a user or in your work as a journalist that you had a first experience with AI
Oh
just
man,
out there in the world.
I don't even know when that was. I mean, I think a lot of times like AI is just really undetected, right? Like I think what really helped me in my work because English is my first language, so I have a little bit of trepidations and anxiety sometimes when I write long articles because I feel like, whoa, this is not my first language. I hope this, this works out and I can express my thoughts and what I want to say. So I think when I first saw Grammarly, I was like, whoa, that is really helpful, not necessarily inviting articles, but actually like inviting emails and sort of helping me nudge me in the right way. And I thought it was like a really helpful tool to like sort of double check my copy and emails and help me be a more professional writer in my professional emails. So I really felt like, oh, there's a weight lifted. Somebody's looking over my shoulder. Somebody's helping me. So I thought that was really cool way to use AI.
And have you, as a journalist, always covered tech topics, or how did you
Not at
find your
all.
way
Not
into
at
this
all.
world?
When I think back about the other things that I've covered as a journalist, like I think I've covered, I think I was really drawn to often like maybe stories with a social justice bend or something, like helping folks who often don't have a voice and letting them speak and showing their world. Before I started on this tech journey, I did an investigative documentary on sexual assault in Pakistan. I did a story on student debt for Vice on HBO. I covered restaurant grading for the Wall Street Journal and I covered New York City. I was always curious about people's worlds. So I just like let my curiosity draw me to places. But usually I think it was like finding underreported stories, finding glaring injustices in the world. And that often felt, like often stories of marginalized folks, especially women. And, I wrote and did a short doc about girls that are being aborted in Southeast Asia. So, it always felt like it looked at like systemic problems in folks who often don't have a voice. So I really didn't have any touch points with tech. I mean, I used tech as a filmmaker. I shot my own films and I, was sort of often doing a rough cut, but I wasn't particularly prone or called to do any kind of tech work. So I was surprised myself how I found my way to tech reporting. It was definitely not on the agenda. I had no particular interest in tech reporting. I think at the time I was thinking about doing a series on problems with marketing in food and products that are overhyped and maybe organic doesn't mean what we think it means. And I was
Mhm.
developing a series on that kind of topic. And I was also going to conferences as a journalist to speak with people and understand, okay, what's happening in the world. One day in November 2017, I was at a conference of consumer lawyers in Washington, D.C., which had nothing to do with AI and tech. They didn't know about big data and they probably still struggle with that, right? I mean, these are people who like defend often, quote unquote, the little guy, people who have student debt, they have consumer loans that they can't pay back, and maybe there is harms done to them by some of the lenders. And that's what these lawyers generally fight for. So, this was looking at like, has there been any systemic abuse and mortgages or something? I was looking around and talking to people. And then after the conference, I needed a ride to the train station. I was in Washington, D.C. at this conference and I caught myself a lift, got in the lift and said hello to the driver and said, like, how are you doing? How was your day? And, he hesitated for a second, say like, it was a weird day. And I was like, oh, it was unexpected. I thought usually people say like, I'm fine. How are you? He was like, no, I had a weird day. And I was like, oh yeah, what happened? And then he said that he was interviewed by a robot for a job. And I was just like, what? I was like, robots doing job interviews? Tell me more. I was like, just very interested. And I was like, I've never heard of this. What? It was like robots doing job interviews. And, he explained that he had applied for a baggage handler position at a local airport. And that afternoon, he got a call from a quote unquote robot asking him 3 questions why he wanted the job and maybe why he was particularly suited for the job. Now we know it's probably were pre recorded questions. But he felt like, what was this, a robot calling me? Clearly, it had like shook his world, it made him really feel uncertain and like, what is this? And I was surprised too, because I'd never heard of this. And, I'm just a curious person. So I was like, oh, yeah, like what exactly happened? And, he recounted this to me. And, I really made a note and I've asked him if I could be in touch and that I've never heard of this. And so we had like a chat on like the 10-15 minute drive to the train station. And I remember really thinking about this. I was like, job interviews by robots? Like, what is this?
It made your justice senses tingle, right? As a
Maybe a little bit.
journalist.
I just felt like I was like, I've
Yeah.
never
I
heard
mean,
of this.
it
And
hit your curiosity bone.
yes, my curiosity
Right?
bone definitely started moving and was like, oh, I've never heard of that. That seems interesting and weird and unusual. And I want to know more. I could also tell that this was like an emotional experience for the driver. And I felt like, how would I feel if I applied for a job and I get a call with a pre recorded voice or like quote unquote robot? And I can totally understand that it could be totally unsettling. And this was also, the early days of AI, like it wasn't really widespread. Now I have students who, they all know HireVue and
It's
one-way video
normalized.
interviews, and it's pretty widespread. But at the time, I don't think really lots of people thought about this or knew about this. And I think the first people that were asked to do these kind of one-way, either video interviews or audio interviews, it was just really unsettling to them. I was like, wow, we like really automating and like digitizing everything. So that's kind of interesting. So, I made a
Yeah.
note in my notebook and, didn't really get busy on this topic for a second. Like I sort of had it in the back of my mind. But a couple months later, I went to a FACT conference in AI accountability. The first one, it was at NYU, so it was easy for me to go. And I think I sort of only went because one of my colleagues was like, oh, hey, we're having this at NYU, you should come. And I was like, okay, I mean, it's around the corner, I can just go. And when I went there, I saw that on the schedule there was a talk by someone who had just left the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She was going to talk about algorithms at work. And I was like, oh, I remembered the driver who got a call from a quote unquote robot. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me go to the session. And it was kind of interesting because there weren't that many people at the session. And it was actually really helpful. The presenter had just left the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission after, Trump took over. And she was talking about that, they did like sort of an inquiry into big data at work. And they found that there are like new algorithms and, maybe AI tools that go through employees' calendars and check out like how long are they at work and check for absenteeism, very basic algorithm. And she said, I can't sleep at night because I'm really worried that once you start checking how long people are at work, you might find that mothers and I should say people who have caregiving obligations, most of the time, those are mothers, and people with disabilities have longer absentee times than others. And she said, I'm really worried that they're going to be discriminated against if you look just at like the physical hours that they are at work. And I was like, wow, yeah, somebody needs to look into this. And I looked around and I was like, it's not many people here. So maybe I should start looking into this. And I chatted with her afterwards and she told me about a company, HireVue, that at the time used facial expression analysis for intonation of voice, AI to infer if you're going to be successful in a job. And I was like, what? This is like all next level. This is so interesting, and it came back to the driver that I met in the Lyft ride who told me about his job interview with robots. And I was like, okay, I think this is like from different parts of the universe. People are telling me somebody has to look into it. And I was like, okay, I'll look
There's a
into it.
pattern
And
here. Yeah.
there's something, like I'm hearing signals, I'm seeing signals, and, I should just follow this. And I remember meeting with my mentor that afternoon and, sitting on his balcony and I was like, I think I need to really look into this. There seems to be really something there. And I was like, emotion expression analysis of our faces, like that seems like all like next level and so interesting. And I was like, have you heard of this? And he's like, no, I haven't. And I was like, okay, I'm going to look into this. So I started calling people, talking to people, and, I talked to the former chief data scientist at HireVue, and he was telling me all about, he calls himself an AI evangelist and like was telling me all about AI and what they do. And I maybe understood 2% of what he was really saying. And, I was like, I don't really understand any of this. But I was like, that seems all very revolutionary and very interesting. And he said, you have to come to this conference where all the industrial and organizational psychologists meet at PsyOp. And, it's in a few weeks in Chicago. And I was like, okay, I must come there. And when I went there, so this is where a lot of HR professionals, the ones that have often a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, who are often maybe the chief science officers in HR departments at very large companies, and think through like, how should we assess people? It's where they gather. And there were thousands of people. and there was every other talk was about AI. And I was like, AI and HR, AI and HR. And I was like, wow, it seems to be quite big. And I was like, I had no idea. And, there were vendors talking about the AI and their products. And I just was like, I have never heard of this.
I would like to clarify, why was AI in HR such a big topic? It wasn't just because it's like a trendy thing. There's a problem that people are trying to solve by using AI. So can we drill a little bit more
Sure,
into
yeah,
that?
yeah. I uncovered this a little bit down the road, right? Like why maybe AI maybe appeal to so many HR departments. And I do understand where a lot of companies are coming from. So I think probably one of the starting points is when we saw first job platforms emerge, like Indeed, Monster, LinkedIn. They really did revolutionize the job search for a lot of job seekers because you didn't have to buy expensive magazines anymore and like craft this, application, this cover letter and mail it. Like it got very easy. You could browse any kind of job openings, are very accessible, and you could very easily apply, right? You can have a cover letter and a resume, and maybe you adjust them a little bit, but a couple of clicks and you could apply. And it's very democratizing and it removes a lot of the barriers of hiring. And, the job platform started with that feeling like, we're going to democratize this hiring space and everyone will have access to applications and they can upload their resumes and just easily apply. And I'm sure companies like that too, because, they got more applicants and appeal to more people. And it was just an easier process. But what I didn't realize is that on the other side, on the company side, what happened is they often get just so many applications and they're just overwhelmed. I think a lot of HR departments are just frankly overwhelmed by the thousands, hundreds of thousands applications they get. And, large companies get millions. So, Google gets around 3 million. IBM gets around 5 million applications per year. I mean, it's like just a vast number. Goldman Sachs gets over 200,000 for their summer internships alone. Those are just vast numbers. And I think most companies don't have the labor force to look through all of these resumes. And, the truth is also that humans are very biased in hiring. Although we think often that we are very objective and can really sort of understand who people are and make an objective decision, science is very clear that we have a lot of unconscious bias. So it's not necessarily always good when humans look at resumes or do job interviews. But I think the companies just felt overwhelmed and felt like, we don't have enough people to look through all these resumes. And, maybe a lot of people apply who are really not that qualified. We need some sort of solution here. And so I think a lot of vendors stepped into that void and felt like, okay, there is like a solution of too many of a good thing, too many applications. So let's build them a digital tool. And I think, as AI was developing, they felt like, oh, we can put some more maybe intelligence tools into this. So not only look for like, okay, the candidate on their resume, so they have the same keywords, but also maybe understand, okay, who's successful at the job and make inferences about people who are currently in the job and sort of compare candidates to that, sort of a higher level analysis than just looking at like counting keywords on a job description versus a resume. So I think that was sort of the beginning, but like we see AI being used all across the hiring funnel, right? They're like sort of different steps. Often it's a resume at the beginning and then traditional way, maybe have a phone interview and then an in-person interview. And now we see often resume screeners at the beginning, and then we see one-way video interviews, or we see, maybe an audio interview, or we see AI game that the candidates are asked to play. So all kinds of screens along the way. And we often see AI and just algorithms doing the rejection at the beginning of the funnel. And then once, the applicant pool is shrunk enough to like just a few candidates, maybe 10 or so, then humans get involved and they make the final decisions, right? But the
Yeah.
rejection we leave to software often.
Can you talk a little bit about the correlation issue?
Oh, yeah.
It's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody would like have told me 6 or 7 years ago, like correlation is not causation, would be like, I don't think I really fully understood what that means. Now I have a very good sense of that. So I think maybe a really good example to sort of, and this is something that happens again and again, is that we see correlations, and we often see this in resume screening, something that is statistically relevant. So I think what often happens with companies, right? You not only want to just do a rogue check of like counting keywords in a job description versus keywords in a resume. It seems very basic. So I think a lot of companies feel like, okay, let's figure out why the 50 accountants that we have now, why are they successful here? Like what is on their resume that makes them different? So maybe you give an AI tool the resumes of the 50 accountants that currently are in the job, and maybe the other people that were in the job the last 2 years, or people that made it to the last round of hiring, because you assume that means sort of they have been quote unquote successful. So you give that to the tool, and the tool sort of figures out, does an analysis of the keyword, which keywords are statistically significant. Statistically, if you have this word on your resume, that implies that you will be successful at this company. So what we've seen is that lots of keywords can be statistically significant. So we've seen like correlations with the word Thomas was statistically significant and meant that people who had the word Thomas on their resume would be presumed to be successful in the job. We also saw keywords like Syria and Canada were other keywords that the AI tool inferred that if you had these words on your resume, you would be successful in the job. This is probably statistically significant because the AI tool picked it out. So it means that probably in the pile of resumes, there were a bunch of Thomases that, were deemed successful. So the AI tool picked up, oh, yeah. So, the name Thomas is statistically significant. So if the word Thomas is on your resume, you will be successful at this job. Obviously, any human would know that the name Thomas doesn't qualify you for anything. Sorry to all the Thomases out there, but what makes you qualified for the job, right? Is like your experience, your abilities, your skills. That makes you qualified for the job, not your first name, not where you're from, right? Like not if you have like Syria or Canada on your resume, which actually could be a discrimination based on national origin. This is not only like fun and games, but it actually could have discriminatory impact and could be actually unlawful. So one of the resume screeners, employment lawyer Ken Wilner, had found out that the word baseball meant that somebody will be successful in the job, and they got more points for the word baseball on their resume. But if they had the word softball on their resume, folks got fewer points. So obviously that in the US context is probably related to gender, right? Like more men watch and play baseball and women traditionally play softball. So I think you sort of
And they're
see like,
probably listing that as a hobby, right, on their
yes,
resume?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yes. Wasn't a head coach of a baseball team. And actually, if that would have been the case, softball would have qualified you for this, right? But these jobs had nothing to do with sports. It's just basically a random keyword that was found on a resume. But I guess on enough resumes that it was statistically significant. So in this case, it was a correlation, right? There's like a lot of people, statistically significant that the word baseball is found on people who are successful in the job. We have no evidence that playing baseball makes you successful in the job. And in fact, in almost all jobs in the world, playing baseball is not, it has nothing to do with your skills and abilities. And I first felt like, when I first talked to the first employment lawyer who found that playing lacrosse in a high school was statistically significant for success in the job, I was like, well, maybe the AI tool found this like new thing that we didn't know, that playing lacrosse in high school does make you very successful in
Makes
the
you a
job.
team player.
Yeah. And he was just like, lady, like, you're not understanding what this is. He's like, look, it's like basically like word counting and understanding like, okay, is this more often than just randomness? And if it's statistically significant, it becomes a predictor of success. He's like,
Right,
the tool
because
doesn't
these models.
know that like playing lacrosse in high school has nothing to do with the job. It's just something that the people who have the job right now have in common. Who knows why? It's
And
kind of like,
Hilka,
yeah.
I think that that's a really interesting, like, it brings up a theme that comes a lot when we're talking about AI, which is there's this expectation that there's a human level of intelligence
Mm.
going on in
Oh,
these
yeah.
models in terms of, like, yes, they can compete with humans in task work, but when it comes to understanding and reasoning and context, unless you are really tuning that model with that context and really pushing it towards that context, it's like an alien from outer space landing and trying to interpret a completely alien society, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I
so
mean, I think it's like us humans trying to connect meaning to any of these findings, right? Like we always feel like, oh, well, it must be meaningful because the computer found it. And it's like, no, if you actually look, it's no meaning. It's just like some random correlation. They were just a
it's a
bunch of
pattern.
Thomases in the
It's a
tool. Yeah.
patterns don't necessarily don't
Uh,
always lead to meanings.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I mean, I think a famous example is like that in the summer month, you see ice cream sales skyrocket and you also see murder skyrocket or the murder numbers go up. So, does the sale of ice cream lead to murders? No, but this correlation happens at the same time. What's causing is summer. So there's a third variable. But I think what we see in hiring, we often forget that like maybe this isn't actually causally related, just like some random occurrence that is statistically significant. It's a correlation, but it doesn't mean anything. But we humans attribute meaning to it. If you think to like a one-way video interview that takes facial expressions and just faces into or video content into its decision making, it might find out that like, people with brown hair are very successful at these jobs because statistically there are more people with brown hair than blonde hair or red hair. So a computer would pick that up as, statistically relevant as a variable that implies success. So it would probably infer that the next job candidate who comes up on screen who has brown hair is going to be successful in the job. Obviously, humans know that that is absolutely not causally connected to anything. It's just a correlation. Just more humans with brown hair. It doesn't mean anything.
There are human biases embedded in this programming as well,
Yes,
though.
yes.
Because if we were doing a facial recognition or a facial interpretation or sentiment analysis in a one-way interview, and you're maybe having an interview with somebody who's neurodivergent, for example, that is one of the features of neurodivergence is often facial expressions or sentiment don't necessarily match the inner workings of that person. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean they're lying. It doesn't mean that they're deceptive. It's just because of the way that folks like me are wired. So, can you talk a little bit about the relationship of training data and bias and outcomes
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
AI?
So I think what we often see is that historical human bias gets baked into these tools through the training data. And I think a really good example is the Amazon example. It's a great example. So Amazon had built a resume screener a few years back that was trained on resumes of people who are currently successful at the company. And I think this was for like sort of more white collar jobs. So the tool was trained with the training data, probably hundreds and thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of resumes. And it found out over time that people with the word women or woman on their resume, like, I don't know, women's chess club, member of women's chess club, or you played in the women's softball team, or, whatever, meant that those folks are not successful in the job. So I think what we have here is like there is already a gender bias at work that probably, Amazon is a tech company and it probably historically has hired more men into tech jobs than women. So that was reflected in the resumes because people with the word women and woman were less successful at Amazon. They weren't hired into jobs. So you have this historical bias that was baked into the AI tool because of the training data that we just gave to the resume parser. And I think we as humans don't think enough about like, okay, like I built this tool, but how is the tool actually making decisions? So we don't really monitor or supervise or sort of fully understand like what is happening? Is this method actually a good idea? And what exactly is the tool inferring success on? Like, what is it basing this label that you're going to be potentially successful or unsuccessful in a job? Like, what is that decision based on? We don't actually ask that enough times. And I think what we also see is, and no one needs to know what that actually means, is like often companies use deep neural networks to build some of these tools. So we know the training data that goes in, we know the results, but we don't actually know how the software comes up with some of the predictions. That strikes me as very problematic because we may not know why out of the 1,000 people whose resumes went into the tool and then were ranked, number one, why did the person who's ranked number one with like a score of 87.16% is like that precise often, and it looks very precise and objective. Why was that person ranked that high? On what basis? Because they have the word baseball on their resume? Or is it because they really have the right skills? And so we don't actually know unless we like keep going back and ask the software to precisely tell us what it inferred on. And I don't see a lot of vendors and companies that are usually doing that. So I think we need to get much more skeptical. And I also think that the training data, a lot of times we think through like, okay, these are resumes of people who've been successful at the job. What does it mean successful at the job? Like who decided, is this like the manager who likes going to drinks with the people and these are the people who are successful? Is this based on annual reviews of performance reviews? Well, those are biased against women and people of color and people with disabilities. We know that from science. Should we use that as like objective metrics? So I think there's a lot of questions, and also in the training data, right? Like, so we see a lot of unconscious bias in human decision making. So we've seen for decades that women, people of color, people with disabilities are underrepresented in the workforce because, for decades, human hiring managers had unconscious bias and didn't think that they could perform to the level of often white men. So the problem is, especially people with disabilities are underrepresented in a lot of companies. So they're not represented in the training data. So they express themselves so that, maybe the words that they use in video interviews would be like, like just a small number in the training data. So probably that wouldn't rise to this statistically significant threshold. So that's a real problem. But also disabilities are often expressed so individually. So maybe you have one person who's autistic in the training data, but that doesn't mean that the next job candidate who's also autistic, their disability might be expressed very differently. So it's just such an individually expressed way. And there's so many disabilities. There's no way we can capture all of that human experience in the training data. So those people sort of by default, how these tools work, will be marginalized, and they're already marginalized. So that's what I'm really worried about, is like that these tools like already take marginalized communities and marginalize even more. But now we have this veneer of objectivity. As a hiring manager, I have this beautiful ranking with percentage. And I mean, it's hard to question that. Even when I did some of these tests, when I really thought about this, I was like, facial expression analysis, emotion analysis in video interviews. How can we infer success about that? We don't have any science telling us like, oh yeah, you have to have this facial expression to be successful in your job. And we certainly don't have any science that looks at like what facial expressions should we have in a job interview to be successful in a job, right? Like there's like too many variables. But then really, a lot of the effective computing AI tools, as they're often known, they also assume that all humans have 6 emotions. So, it's really good at reading our facial movements. So we'll read like, okay, mouth is going up, like forward brow, it can sense that and do a readout. But does that mean because I'm smiling, I'm happy? No, it doesn't. So we all know that. And, I have a particular personal problem that I sometimes have. Sometimes I get misfires of my emotions a lot because I have a resting bitch face. So, what happened a lot sometimes, I meet with my students and I just look at them, or I think I just neutrally look at them. They're like, are you mad at me? Are you angry? And I'm like, no, hi, I'm just looking at you. So apparently I have a resting bitch face. I get, miscalled all the time. But, I wonder like if I was being screened by an effective computing tool, my facial expression would probably be read as angry, even though I'm not angry. So I think that sort of points to the larger problem that psychologists have now said over and over again, that like from a smile or a facial expression, you cannot infer how everyone feels. We do not feel the same way.
So the last thing you want is a bunch of AI tools telling women you should smile more,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, it would have certainly told me that. And I now have bangs that the problem is contained for humans and AI tools a little bit. I haven't gotten a complaint in a long time.
First of all, I want to talk about generative AI
Mhm.
because that's emerged. What are you seeing in terms of how it's impacting HR technology and screening, and
Yeah.
also applying?
I think, we just see it emerging on the employer side. We haven't seen a ton of generative AI. I mean, I'm thinking that like there are a bunch of great use cases to use sort of large language models for sort of chatbots. If you want to know, how many vacation days do I have left? Like, sort of like very basic HR questions. And I don't think you need to have a human to look at all of that. That's great. Like a chatbot would be really great to help companies with that. On the hiring side, I actually think generative AI has been really great for a lot of job seekers. And I think some of them felt really empowered the last year or so, because I think they often felt very disempowered by, you have to send out your resume with one click, but you never hear back. You have no idea where you're sending it, go somewhere into a black hole. And, a lot of job seekers know that AI is being used. And now they feel like, wait a second, I can use ChatGPT and other chatbots to help me write a cover letter, to polish my resume, to maybe, sort of think through, can I use it for this particular job? I can upload the job description and like change my resume according to the job description. And this tool can help me with this. And we've also seen job seekers use ChatGPT to ask for, what are the most asked questions in job interviews? What are the best answers to this? And like train for job interviews. So I think it has like emboldened some job seekers and, given them more power a little bit. And, I've seen a lot of jokes on like job platforms and where people congregate and sort of be like, oh yeah, like, I generated my cover letter with AI and my resume. Let the best AI win, right? It's like AI versus AI. And, not every HR person is like excited about this, but, they're also using AI. So, I mean, good for some job seekers to use the tools of the day to help them with their job search. I think on the employer side, we're seeing like slowly this coming in. I think we've seen a little bit of misfires that I know some HR managers who were like, okay, let's just load up the job description and here are like the 10 resumes that we have in the final round, and just load it up to a large language model and let us tell us who to choose. And I mean, we don't actually know what large language models infer exactly. Like we don't actually know how the decision making is made. And I think that strikes me as really wrong. Hopefully they just did this to test and not actually made high stakes decisions on people. Because I think that's something that I deeply care about in this whole arena is like, I think often in hiring, we think, we as job seekers send out so many applications and we are so used to getting rejected. It's just it's part of the game, it's just who it is. But I actually do feel it matters why we were rejected, and it matters if we get the job. Like I'm very nervous before job interviews because this matters to me if I get the job, right? It could change my life. Like, first of all, most of us need to work to have a roof over our head and provide food for us and our children. So I think that, it's a basic human need. And then for a lot of us, like, I love my job. It's tied to like who I am, my happiness. I mean, it's incredibly meaningful. So when I applied for my current job, I was nervous and I worked for weeks on, my job talk and what I had to do because it did matter to me. And, if I would have been rejected because I wasn't the most qualified, maybe my skills weren't right, I would have been really sad because it was my dream job. But I would have lived with that. But if I would have learned that, part of the decision making was an AI tool that had discarded my resume because, the word woman was on there, I would have been absolutely devastated and upset. Like
And
that's not
and
fair.
that's illegal. It's illegal,
Yeah,
you
in this case, it
know?
would also be gender discrimination, right? But the problem is like vendors don't often look very closely what exactly the AI tool infers upon, right? Like, and then we have companies who buy these tools to have more efficient decision making, right? They're not going to hire more people to now supervise these tools, right? They want like an easy solution to make their work faster and more efficient. They're not necessarily going to look into the tool. And we as job applicants, we have no transparency whatsoever to understand why were we rejected or got into the next round. So none of us is the wiser. And we don't actually often know what goes wrong in these tools. It's just like, I just happen to talk to these employment lawyers when sometimes vendors and companies, either when they think about buying a new tool, they maybe bring in employment lawyers and other sort of people adjacent to this field to do due diligence, or sometimes maybe they already have the tool and they're just not sure is it working. They bring in outside counsel to test it. And then that is when sometimes these problems come up. I was just taking it back when I talked to some of these people like John Scott. He looked at 5 resume screeners and he said all 5 of them had biased variables. Ken Wilner said like all of the tools he looked at, about a quarter of them had really problematic, discriminatory words in them that it inferred success on. And then, when I talked to Matthew Scherer, he's a former employment lawyer who also was often brought in when it comes to AI tools. And he said that all of the tools that he looked at were not ready for prime time. So
What do you want after this? And I know that you're a journalist. You're
yes,
reporting on this. You're just illuminating this issue. But after this, what is surfacing as a way forward? Because we're not going
yeah,
to go. Nobody's going to
then we're
put
not
the
going to go
genie
back.
back in the bottle,
Yeah, totally,
right?
totally. I mean, my big hope is that we can have a more educated discussion. How should we really hire? Like, what tools should we use? How should we build them? And we shouldn't like just use the old wrong ways of hiring and now digitize it and put a veneer of objectivity. Like, should we actually use resumes? Should we use one-way video interviews? Is that actually a good way to assess talent? I'm not so sure. And it's certainly not a good way to just have somebody play a game and either their personality jives with the people in the job or not and reject them. Like, can we have a more holistic way of hiring? Can we look at people in a more 360 way? Can we also look at the teams that they're getting hired into, right? Because it strikes me as like so interesting that we always like look at one person and check like, is this the right person? But if we put that person in a toxic team, they're not going to succeed. So I think we need to like approach hiring in a different way. I think also these AI tools, they're here to stay. So let's build good ones that work and don't discriminate. So let's actually do that work. And, I think there's a few people who need to be part of that, right? I think HR managers need to be absolutely more skeptical. They need to steal my methods and test these tools. And like, I'm not a coder, I'm not a machine learning expert and builder. Like if I can break these tools on impact, we're in a lot of trouble. And I think a lot of HR managers can use these methods to just test these tools, make basic tests to understand like how are they built, what assumptions maybe they're built on, how do they infer success. And if it's problematic, don't buy these tools and tell others. Like we need transparency around these tools. If they don't work, we need to put pressure on the vendors to build them better. And I think we also need, sort of guardrails from regulatory agencies and legislators. Every few thoughts on that, but I think we also really need the field itself to get much more skeptical. I think we're already on the way, and I think my book is part of that wave to just sort of illuminate. Here are the many ways that AI is actually harming folks in the hiring and their work, and here's how we need to do it differently. So I
Have you
have some,
encountered
yeah.
any frameworks or approaches that are like repeatable in
Yes.
if
So I have
if you
a
want
whole
to point
list.
us toward a source? Yeah,
Yeah.
amazing.
So I have a whole list of like what to do. I'm a little bit circumspect to audits because I've reported on them, and I actually think there's a conflict of interest at heart if companies give money to auditors to audit their tools. So I think what might be helpful is like be much more skeptical as an HR manager, read the technical reports and really scrutinize them. How was the tool built and validated, and what tests were made to make sure that they're not discriminatory? Also, monitor these tools over time, test these tools in pilot studies, like run a pilot study for a year that and you're not making any decision, and like really figure out, does this tool work and are the results discriminatory, and does it actually pick the most qualified candidates, or is it random? If it's random, a random number generator is free and it's actually fair. You don't need to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then I think we need, if we had just a little bit more transparency in these tools, I think a lot of civil society groups could step in and actually test these tools, and possibly, like, it's my hope, because I don't think we'll see a lot of government regulation, the government starting to test these tools en masse, but maybe we need to take out the economic pressure from vendors who are often startups and who need to make money back for their investors, so they don't have time to actually do the science. They don't have time to actually think through like all of these methods, what tools and processes they use to infer if somebody will be successful at the job and if it's discriminatory. So let's build our own tools for the public good and put that all in the public domain. Put the 10 ways that we tried to build a resume screener and it didn't work into the public domain, put in how we built it, so that we put pressure on companies to do the right thing and choose the right ways of hiring.
For vendors who want to do it right, and I happen to work for one, uh, what do you need them to know?
So I think all of the vendors have very good intentions, right? Like I should say, like, I think this is like just a tale of unintended consequences, right? I don't think anyone is sitting there being an HR manager or vendor who's like, oh yeah, I really want to exclude women in the workforce. No one is doing that, right? But what we see is like sort of when we don't scrutinize and be skeptical about like the training data or the historical data that we put into these tools, these biases can just come up again and again because we're not closely scrutinizing it. So I think what I would love from vendors is like very clear transparency. What assumptions were built into the tool? Like, what is the science? How you validate it? What is the discriminatory test that you've run? And not only for gender and race, but what is with people who are older, age, other protected statuses, disabilities? I think if a vendor doesn't have a technical report, how they did all this, that's already a red flag. But I don't understand why these technical reports are not public. Like, why can I read them? I got it from some companies that gave it to me, but I think like we all should be putting that public. How did vendors test these tools? What assumption, what academic literature is built on this? Like, what's the evidence that this works? So I think, we need much more transparency from vendors. So I think that's what I would tell them. And maybe publish their own audits and how they built these tools and how they test these tools. I think that would go a very long way. I also hope that like companies will start to work with more academics on this and journalists. Like, I'm happy to run longitudinal studies to actually, can we hire people maybe the traditional way and hire them with different AI tools and sort of follow them for years and have those labels assigned to them, right? Like usually AI tools say like, yes, no, maybe, or, have different labels, obviously not tell the people and their managers, but sort of understand like, are these people en masse successful? I think that would be really a wonderful thing for humanity if we would see that. I have not heard of it, but I would love to see that.
Amazing. Is there anything that I did not ask you that you would like to discuss?
No, I think we had such a wonderful time talking about all this. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah. God, I could go on. I could go on for
I
another
know,
hour,
me too.
honestly.
It doesn't, like thinking about how computers and software quantifies humans, and sort of like comparing that to the human experience, I think is just endlessly fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this amazing discussion.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you for having me.
we're going to do a little plug for your book, obviously, but is there anything else that you want to point us toward that can help us either follow you or learn more about this topic?
Yeah, totally. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I think most of us have, left X or Twitter behind. And I actually think that LinkedIn is the right place to have these discussions, right? Because we congregate there to talk about work and, a lot of job seekers are there. So I think that is probably the right platform to find me, to follow me. I'm like super interested in hearing from job applicants or companies who want to share their experiences. I think that will help us move the needle and make the world a little better for hiring and AI at work.
Thank you so much, Ilka.
Yeah, thank you for having me.